Two young tourists vanished in the vast Utah desert in 2011. Days later, their bodies were found, brutally murdered. The killer disappeared into the wilderness, leaving behind only whispers of a phantom that haunted the Red Canyons. For 8 long years, silence ruled, until 2019, when 2 fresh bodies were discovered inside an abandoned mine, seated side by side in a scene more chilling than fiction. Tonight, we reopen the case of the Desert Phantom, the killer who vanished, and the terrifying discovery that brought him back into the light. The Utah desert in the summer of 2011 looked endless, stretching out in layers of red cliffs, sandstone arches, and deep canyons. For 2 young tourists, Emma from France and Daniel from the United Kingdom, the vast landscape promised freedom and adventure. They were in their mid-20s, full of energy, eager to see the famous American wilderness they had only read about in travel guides. They arrived in Moab, a small desert town known for outdoor adventures, mountain biking, and the gateway to Arches and Canyonlands national parks. At first, their days were filled with excitement. They snapped photos of the red rock formations, walked through quiet trails, and shared laughter at local diners. To them, the desert was breathtaking, almost like stepping into another world. They felt safe, like nothing could harm them here. They did not realize how unforgiving this landscape could become when things went wrong. Moab had long been a magnet for travelers from across the world. Its postcard beauty, with rivers cutting through red canyons and endless trails, lured visitors who wanted adventure. Yet locals often reminded newcomers that the desert was not always kind. Old mines dotted the land, some fenced off but many left wide open, shafts that dropped hundreds of feet into darkness. Park rangers regularly warned hikers not to leave marked trails, because once you wandered into the backcountry, rescue could be nearly impossible. Emma and Daniel, however, wanted more than the regular tourist experience. They asked locals about hidden spots, hoping to see a wilder, untouched side of Utah. A waitress at a diner mentioned an old road used by miners decades ago, a place few tourists ever visited. She told them it was beautiful but remote. Her last words were half joking, half serious. Just be careful out there. The next morning, Emma and Daniel packed their small rental car with water bottles, maps, and cameras. They left early, just after sunrise, when the desert air was still cool. Their excitement grew as they drove deeper into the empty landscape, leaving behind paved roads for dusty tracks. Along the way, they stopped to take photographs, sending text messages to friends back home about the real desert they were exploring. Around midday, other hikers saw their vehicle parked along a dirt path that wound between towering cliffs. That sighting was the last time anyone saw them alive. When the couple did not return to their motel that evening, the manager thought perhaps they had decided to camp under the stars. But when another day passed without check-in, phone calls, or sightings, concern quickly turned into alarm. By the second day, their families overseas had also reported not hearing from them. Authorities in Moab took the case seriously from the start. A missing persons report was filed, and search and rescue teams were deployed almost immediately. Volunteers, deputies, and even tourists joined in, combing through trails, riverbeds, and abandoned mine entrances. Helicopters scanned the desert from above, their searchlights sweeping across the rugged land. The heat was brutal during the day, while nights dropped into chilling cold. Searchers feared dehydration, injury, or worse. After several days of intense searching, faint tire tracks and footprints were found near a dry wash, but they led nowhere clear. The couple's rented car was eventually located, parked near the edge of an old mining road, doors locked, and supplies still inside. Hope faded quickly after that. The desert was too vast, too silent, and too merciless. After nearly 3 weeks, when many feared the worst, the grim discovery finally came. The desert had revealed its secret. Deep inside a shaded grove near a canyon wash, searchers stumbled upon the bodies of Emma and Daniel. They had been hidden crudely under brush and branches, as though someone wanted them covered but not buried. The scene was horrifying. Daniel's wrists were bound, his face bruised, and Emma's clothing was torn. Investigators on site quickly determined this was no accident, no case of hikers lost to nature. They had been murdered. News spread through Moab within hours, shocking the community. Residents who were used to welcoming travelers with open arms suddenly felt their safety ripped away. The sheriff of San Juan County held a press conference, voice heavy with emotion, stating, "We believe this was a deliberate act of violence." Reporters flooded into town, national headlines blared the tragedy, and locals whispered about what kind of person could commit such brutality in the middle of such unforgiving isolation. The FBI was quickly brought in, recognizing that the murder of international tourists could not be treated as a local case alone. Forensic experts searched the scene carefully, collecting fibers, soil samples, and anything that could hold a clue. But the desert offered little. No murder weapon was found. No fingerprints, no usable DNA, no clear evidence pointed to a suspect. Investigators did note traces of vehicle tires, possibly from an older pickup truck, but such vehicles were common across Utah. Interviews with locals produced vague memories. Some claimed to have seen a man camping alone near canyons. Others mentioned a stranger asking for fuel in town. But none of these leads held weight. To detectives, it felt as though the killer had appeared suddenly, struck with precision, and vanished back into the wilderness. The investigation was left with shadows and silence, not the solid answers families were begging for. As investigators dug deeper, the town's atmosphere shifted. Moab thrived on tourism, but after the murders, visitors grew hesitant. Families canceled hiking trips, and businesses reported fewer bookings. Locals spoke in hushed tones about what had happened, uneasy about how such violence could reach their quiet town. Some feared a transient drifter, others suspected someone who knew the desert too well. The sheriff's office released a sketch of a man of interest, based on one hiker's vague description of a scruffy man near the old mining road. But the sketch brought no breakthrough. National news outlets debated whether this was the work of a serial predator passing through the region. Some experts compared it to other unsolved murders in the West, hinting at a larger pattern. Yet, as weeks passed, no connection was proven. For the grieving families, media speculation was cruel. What they needed was justice, not theories. Detectives refused to give up. They sent samples to labs, hoping new technology could uncover something missed. They tracked down every registered vehicle matching the tire impressions, yet no match was conclusive. A handful of potential suspects were questioned, but each was eventually cleared. Frustration grew within the task force. The desert, with its countless hiding places, felt like an accomplice to the killer. Months passed, and without fresh leads, progress slowed. One FBI profiler suggested the killer may have been a survivalist, someone who knew how to vanish in rugged terrain. Others thought he might have been a local with knowledge of abandoned mines and back roads. The more theories emerged, the fewer answers investigators actually had. The desert swallowed clues faster than they could be found. Each dead end hurt the families further, turning their grief into desperation as hope of justice slipped further away. The murders had taken on a haunting presence in Moab. Candlelight vigils were held in memory of Emma and Daniel, their photos framed by flowers and messages left by strangers who had never met them. The sheriff promised the case remained open, though privately officers admitted progress was slim. Some residents said they no longer hiked alone, convinced the killer could still be hiding somewhere nearby. Rumors spread quickly. Children dared each other to approach abandoned mines, whispering that the killer lives down there. Online forums filled with speculation, from drifters to cartel members to serial killers. But rumors could not replace evidence. For the families, each passing day without answers felt unbearable. Emma's father spoke softly at a memorial. "We came here for beauty. It has become a grave." His words echoed the community's heartbreak, yet no one could answer the question of who. The investigation lingered with a mix of determination and defeat. Detectives traveled across state lines, checking if other unsolved murders matched the pattern, but no definitive link was found. FBI profilers said the killer had likely killed before or would kill again. Yet there were no new victims in Utah that matched. The silence was both relief and terror. Had the killer moved on, or was he still watching from the shadows? Families clung to hope, but every lead seemed to dissolve. Online, amateur sleuths dissected every detail, sometimes creating more confusion than clarity. The sheriff admitted during a press briefing, "We are running into dead ends, but we are not closing this case." Still, hope was thin. Locals grew weary of the story, businesses pushed to move past it, but the memory lingered. The desert was too vast, and the killer too careful. No one knew if he would ever be found. The desert, once a place of awe for Emma and Daniel, became a symbol of dread for many. At night, the mesas rose like dark sentinels, keeping secrets no one could uncover. Locals said the land felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by the memory of violence that had gone unanswered. The official line from the sheriff's office was always the same: the investigation remains open. But in truth, the trail had gone cold. Detectives moved to other assignments, families were left with grief, and the community slowly adjusted to life under the shadow of an unsolved crime. Still, the legend persisted. Tourists asked about the murders, locals shook their heads, and children whispered stories of a phantom killer hiding in the mines. The silence of the desert was no longer peaceful. It carried fear. The killer had vanished, and no one could say when, or if, he would strike again. The weeks after the murders of Emma and Daniel were filled with grief that reached far beyond Utah. Their families, thousands of miles away, were shattered by the news. Emma's parents, who had once been proud of her adventurous spirit, now sat in their home in Lyon, France, staring at photos of her smiling face and asking how such cruelty could find her in a place she thought was safe. Daniel's mother in Manchester, England, struggled to leave her house, her son's laughter echoing in every room like a memory too painful to bear. Across the ocean, their loss felt like an open wound. They had sent their children off to explore the world, never imagining they would return only as names in a police report. The shock was not only personal but national. International media ran headlines of the murders, sparking outrage and sympathy from strangers who never knew them. In Moab, the tragedy left the community shaken to its core. Locals were used to hearing stories of lost hikers or heat-related rescues, but murder was something different. Murder suggested an active danger still present among them. The cafes, gas stations, and small shops that usually thrived on tourist traffic now carried a sense of unease. Conversations were hushed, eyes lingered longer on strangers, and the usual friendliness of the town seemed dimmed. Tourism, the backbone of the local economy, began to suffer. Families who had planned vacations to hike arches or raft the Colorado River canceled their bookings, not wanting to risk safety. Even seasoned adventurers avoided certain backroads and canyon trails, especially near abandoned mining sites. The murders hung like a storm cloud over the desert town, a reminder that something dark had entered their landscape and might still be lurking in the red cliffs and canyons. Local law enforcement was caught in a painful bind. The San Juan County Sheriff's Office had never faced a case of this magnitude. The murders of 2 international tourists drew the eyes of the world, and every failure to find answers felt magnified. Detectives poured through every lead, working alongside the FBI, but progress was frustratingly slow. Evidence from the scene had offered almost nothing useful. Witness statements were vague, unreliable, and conflicting. The sheriff admitted in private meetings that he felt powerless against the vastness of the desert, where a killer could vanish into hundreds of square miles of empty land. FBI agents tried to reassure the families and the press that the investigation remained active, but even they confessed to colleagues that they were chasing shadows. The more time passed, the colder the trail grew, and with it came the heavy weight of public disappointment and private frustration. For Emma's father, grief was unbearable, but silence from investigators was worse. He had flown to Utah in the days after her body was discovered, standing among strangers in a desert that had swallowed his daughter's final moments. He stayed weeks, asking questions, pleading with detectives for answers, and walking the trails where she had taken her last steps. Journalists followed him, documenting his sorrow, and his quiet words became part of the national narrative. I do not want revenge. I want truth. For him, the truth mattered more than anything, because without it, Emma's death felt like a story without an ending. When he finally returned to France, he carried with him more questions than answers, but he refused to let the case disappear. His persistence, though born of grief, would later make him one of the anchor voices in keeping the story alive when others began to move on. Daniel's brother, James, also became an important figure in the aftermath. Unlike his parents, who grieved quietly, James turned his pain into action. He was only in his late 20s at the time, a teacher by profession, but he began organizing campaigns online, reaching out to advocacy groups, and contacting news outlets to keep the case in the public eye. His voice was emotional but steady, often reminding people that his brother had been more than a headline. Daniel loved life, James told one reporter. He was a son, a brother, a friend. He should be remembered for that, not just for how he died. James's efforts gave the family a sense of purpose, but they also placed him in constant contact with investigators. He became a bridge between grieving families and frustrated law enforcement, pushing for updates, demanding accountability, and refusing to let his brother's case fade into silence. As months passed, frustration turned into anger for many in the community. Residents began questioning whether the authorities were capable of solving the case at all. Some accused the sheriff of being in over his head, while others blamed the FBI for failing to use their resources effectively. At town meetings, citizens asked why there were no suspects, no arrests, no clear path forward. Officials could only answer with vague promises that the investigation is ongoing. Meanwhile, the lack of progress fed rumors. People spoke of drifters who camped near the river, of strange vehicles spotted on back roads, of whispers about drug runners using the desert as a cover. With every unanswered question, suspicion grew, and myths began to form. The killer became less a man and more a phantom in the minds of locals, someone who could move silently through the land and disappear whenever he wished. The abandoned mines around Moab became the focus of countless stories. Children dared each other to approach the rusted gates, claiming the killer lived underground, hiding in the black tunnels left behind by history. Older residents remembered strange encounters from years before, unfamiliar men setting up camp near mine entrances, flashlights moving through canyons at night. Whether these stories were true or not didn't matter. The more they were told, the more they stuck. For some, the killer was a phantom miner, a shadowy figure who knew the land better than anyone. For others, it was something darker, a ghostly presence born from the desert itself. These myths spread faster than facts, filling the empty space left by the lack of evidence. They made the desert seem alive, not just with beauty, but with menace, and gave the crime an almost supernatural aura that frightened even seasoned locals. At the same time, journalists continued to cover the case, though the tone shifted as months dragged on without new developments. Some national outlets pulled away, focusing on fresher tragedies, while local reporters tried to keep the story alive. Among them was Sarah Collins, a young investigative journalist working for a small Utah newspaper. Sarah was different from others. She didn't just want headlines, she wanted answers. She spent days interviewing locals, hiking trails where the couple had walked, and combing through public records. What drew her in wasn't just the mystery of the murders, but the way the community itself was unraveling under fear and speculation. Sarah became a quiet but steady presence, her articles reminding readers that the victims were real people and the case was far from solved. In time, her voice would become one of the strongest anchors in keeping the tragedy from being forgotten. For investigators, the situation grew heavier with every passing month. Pressure came from multiple sides, grieving families demanding updates, locals demanding safety, and officials demanding results. Yet the evidence simply wasn't there. One FBI agent admitted privately to Sarah Collins during an interview, "This land swallows everything. Tracks, evidence, people, it doesn't leave much behind." His words captured the hopelessness many felt, though they were never spoken in official press conferences. Officers still conducted occasional sweeps of mines and washes, but without fresh leads, each effort felt like wandering blind. Detectives began to rotate off the case, leaving a smaller group still committed but increasingly discouraged. To the families, this was unbearable. They feared their loved ones would become nothing more than names in a file cabinet. To the community, it was a reminder that the killer could still be out there, unseen but never forgotten. Tourism, which Moab relied on for survival, continued to suffer. Business owners begged local leaders to reassure visitors, but fear was difficult to erase. Some routes and trails saw far fewer hikers than before. Campgrounds that once filled during summer now sat half empty. Travelers posted warnings online, telling others to avoid the area. The economy felt the weight of tragedy as much as the families did. Some business owners even blamed the press, saying the constant coverage had exaggerated the danger. Yet no one could deny that the murders had changed the way people saw the desert. What had once been marketed as wide-open freedom now carried an image of hidden danger. For locals, every stranger who passed through town seemed suspicious. For visitors, every canyon felt like a place where something terrible might happen. The desert had always been wild, but now it was stained with fear. Months stretched into a year, and the case showed no real progress. Myths hardened into local legends. Some swore the killer had been a trucker passing through. Others insisted he was a drifter living in the desert. A few whispered about cartel activity, pointing to Utah's long stretches of lonely highways as possible smuggling routes. Sarah Collins, the journalist, listened carefully but reported responsibly, separating rumor from fact. In her articles, she noted how fear was shaping the town as much as the crime itself. She wrote about families too afraid to let children wander, about hikers who refused to step off main trails, about the shadow that had fallen across Moab. Yet even she admitted in private conversations that the lack of answers gnawed at her. "It's like we're all holding our breath," she told a colleague, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the desert to speak again. Then, just as the grief and silence felt permanent, a chilling detail surfaced. During a casual conversation at a local bar, a retired miner told Sarah Collins about a memory from the summer of 2011. He claimed that weeks before the tourists disappeared, he had seen a lone man wandering near one of the abandoned mine entrances, carrying tools that didn't look like mining gear. At the time, he thought nothing of it. But after the murders, the image stayed in his mind, gnawing at him. Sarah pressed him for more, and though details were vague, his story hinted at a possibility investigators had never confirmed. Perhaps the killer wasn't just passing through. Perhaps he had been hiding, right there in the mines, waiting. Sarah passed the tip to authorities. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to shake the silence. The desert, it seemed, still had more secrets to tell. By 2012, the murders of Emma and Daniel had already begun to fade from headlines. Other stories took their place: wildfires, politics, new crimes that demanded the public's attention. For the families, though, time moved differently. Every morning was the same ache, a reminder that their children's killers still walked free. For investigators, the case sat like a weight on the shelf. Detectives still revisited old files, but each lead led nowhere, and eventually, other cases piled on top. What had once been the largest manhunt in the county's history became a thin folder in a filing cabinet marked unsolved. The desert, unchanged and unmoved, stood as a silent witness to the crime, offering no answers. Tourists began to return, slowly and cautiously, as if daring themselves to believe the land had forgotten. But the locals never truly did. For them, the silence of the desert was a constant reminder. Detectives who had poured their hearts into the investigation began to retire. Some left law enforcement altogether, their careers marked by the failure to solve the Moab murders. Sheriff Williams, who had spoken so emotionally at early press conferences, stepped down in 2015, carrying regret that he could not bring justice to the grieving families. Younger deputies inherited the case files, but without fresh evidence, they could do little more than maintain them. Occasionally, a new sheriff's candidate promised to reopen the investigation if elected, but nothing meaningful came of it. For FBI agents, the case was one of many cold files scattered across the West, where killers disappeared into landscapes too vast to fully search. The official updates grew shorter, more formal, and more distant. For families hoping for closure, each passing year felt like a betrayal, as if the system had quietly abandoned their children's memory. The families lived with grief that did not soften. Emma's parents, back in France, created a small foundation in her name, dedicated to supporting young women traveling abroad. They gave speeches at universities, warning of risks, but their words were laced with sorrow. Daniel's brother James kept up his online campaign, but engagement slowly dwindled. People moved on, distracted by new tragedies, and James found himself shouting into the void. His parents, crushed by loss, retreated into silence. For both families, holidays became unbearable, marked by empty chairs and unspoken memories. Friends tried to comfort them, but nothing could replace what was stolen. The worst part was not knowing. They could live with grief, but not with the absence of answers. Each time they looked at the calendar, the years reminded them how long the killer had lived free, while their children remained frozen in 2011. In Moab, life returned to something like normal, at least on the surface. Tourists flooded back by 2014, drawn once again by the arches, canyons, and rivers. Rafting companies boomed, campgrounds filled, and restaurants buzzed with chatter in different languages. But beneath the surface, the murders remained a scar. Locals still whispered about the killer that got away. Parents warned their children to avoid hiking alone. Campers joked nervously about hearing footsteps outside their tents. Even as businesses flourished again, unease remained in the air, like a shadow that never quite lifted. The desert itself seemed complicit. Its beauty attracted thousands, yet those who had lived through 2011 could not look at the red cliffs without remembering the blood spilled beneath them. The land had not changed, but the way people saw it had. Every trail carried a memory, every canyon a whisper of the danger that once lurked unseen. The legend of the murders began to take on a life of its own. Stories shifted with every retelling. Some locals swore the killer was a drifter who had moved on, while others believed he was still nearby, blending in with the town. Tour guides avoided talking about it, but adventurous hikers sometimes whispered about the Phantom of Moab. Internet forums spun their own myths, claims of a survivalist living in the mines, or a man who killed strangers as a ritual before vanishing. None of these stories were based on fact, but they filled the gap left by silence. For tourists, the myths became part of the strange allure of the desert, while for residents, they were a constant reminder of unfinished business. The truth was simple: no one knew. And in that vacuum, imagination made the killer more than human. He became an invisible presence, a shadow stitched into the land. Sarah Collins, the journalist who had followed the case closely in 2011, never let it go. While others moved on, she carried the weight of the unsolved mystery. By 2015, she was no longer just a local reporter. She had gained recognition for her persistence and empathy in telling difficult stories. Still, the Moab murders were the case that haunted her most. She kept boxes of notes, taped interviews, and photographs pinned above her desk. Each time she tried to set the story aside, she found herself pulled back. For Sarah, it wasn't only about justice for Emma and Daniel. It was about the community, about the way fear had reshaped people's lives. Sometimes she dreamed of the desert, vast and silent, with a figure just out of sight. She knew she was not alone in her obsession. Families grieved, locals whispered, and she carried their voices into her work. Sarah's personal life began to suffer under the weight of her obsession. Friends told her to move on, to focus on stories she could actually solve, but she couldn't. Relationships strained, nights stretched long as she reread old files, and her notebooks filled with questions that had no answers. She traveled often back to Moab, sometimes walking the very trails where the couple had vanished, searching for details she might have missed. Each trip felt both grounding and unsettling, as if the land itself was keeping secrets from her. At times, she wondered if she had become part of the story, not just a journalist, but someone trapped by the same silence that trapped the families. Yet she pressed forward, convinced the truth would someday surface. The killer, she believed, was still out there, and secrets could not stay buried forever, not even in the vast, empty desert. By 2017, 6 years had passed without progress, and the Moab murders were little more than a cold file to most law enforcement. Detectives who had once chased every rumor now referred to the case with a resigned shake of the head. "We did everything we could," one retired deputy told Sarah. "Sometimes the desert wins." His words echoed what many locals already believed, that the land itself had protected the killer. The abandoned mines, the endless washes, the hidden trails, they were all possible hiding places, and all impossible to search completely. For the families, the sense of abandonment grew stronger. James, still active online, called the case a scar no one wants to look at. For Emma's parents, hope shrank with every year, though they still lit candles on her birthday. The silence stretched on, heavy and merciless, as if time itself conspired to erase the memory. Despite the silence, small reminders of the case lingered. At local diners, tourists occasionally asked about the murders, and older residents would lower their voices to answer. It was bad, they'd say, but it's over now. Parents still told their children not to wander near old mines, framing the warning as both safety advice and a tale of fear. On the anniversary each year, Sarah wrote a piece for her paper, retelling the tragedy, urging people not to forget. Few outside Utah paid attention anymore, but within the community, the murders remained part of its identity, like a secret carved into the stone walls of the canyons. The killer had become less of a suspect and more of a myth, someone faceless, hiding in every shadow. To locals, he was no longer a man. He was the one who got away, a ghost who lived in the desert silence. For Sarah, the hardest part was the lack of closure. She often replayed her interviews with Emma's father, hearing his quiet plea for truth. She remembered James's determined voice, trying to keep his brother's memory alive. These weren't just names in a file to her. They were people whose lives had been broken open by a stranger. She felt guilty that she could go home at night, while they lived every day with the unanswered question, why? Sometimes, when deadlines pressed and other stories demanded her focus, Sarah thought of letting the case rest. But then a photograph would fall out of her files, or a detail would resurface, and she would find herself pulled back in. The desert wasn't done with her. She could feel it in her bones, that silence was waiting, not ending. And the killer, wherever he was, remained hidden but never gone. By 2018, the community had learned to live with the unsolved murders, but the story had not vanished completely. Locals still used it as a warning for tourists, telling them to stick to marked trails. Some even marketed the legend, turning the phantom killer into a ghost story told around campfires. But beneath the storytelling was unease that never faded. Many believed the killer was still alive, somewhere out there, blending into another town, or perhaps still watching from the desert's edge. Others convinced themselves he had died, taken by the same unforgiving land that had hidden him so well. The uncertainty was what haunted people most. For Sarah, it was a reminder that killers rarely stop. She suspected he would surface again, though she didn't know when or how. Until then, the story was suspended in silence, like a clock that had stopped ticking but not yet broken. By the time 2019 approached, 8 long years had passed since Emma and Daniel's deaths. The case had been boxed up, filed away, and left to gather dust in storage rooms. The families continued their private rituals of remembrance, while Sarah kept her quiet watch. The desert carried on as if nothing had happened, its arches and cliffs drawing more tourists than ever. Yet for those who remembered, every view of the landscape was tinged with unease. The killer had never been caught. He had never spoken, never left a trace, never confessed. He had become mythical, like a ghost born of stone and silence. Some said he was long gone. Others said he was still out there, waiting. The truth was buried, hidden in canyons and shadows. But one thing was certain: time had not erased the story. It had only made it darker, heavier, and harder to bear. And so, by 2019, the Moab murders remained an open wound with no healing in sight. For the families, grief had become a permanent part of their lives. For detectives, the case was a mark of failure. For the town, it was a legend whispered in cautious tones. And for Sarah Collins, it was an obsession she could not release. The killer's absence had made him larger than life, transforming him from a suspect into a phantom in the collective imagination. No one knew if he was dead or alive, near or far, forgotten or planning his next move. The silence stretched longer than anyone thought possible. But silence, Sarah knew, had its limits. The desert might bury secrets, but it never buried them forever. Somewhere in the Red Rock Canyons, the truth waited. And when it finally came, it would shatter everything they thought they knew. In the fall of 2019, the Utah desert was alive again with tourists. Families filled the campgrounds, hikers explored arches, and the hum of adventure echoed through Moab. The murders of 2011 had become a distant memory to most, whispered only by locals or remembered on anniversaries. But on one quiet October morning, everything changed. A group of amateur explorers, curious about abandoned mines scattered near the San Juan County border, stumbled upon something that froze them in place. The mine shaft was dark, filled with stale air and the smell of rust. As their flashlights cut across the interior, the beams landed on two figures seated against the wall. At first, they thought they were mannequins placed there as a cruel prank. But when they stepped closer, their mistake became clear. The bodies were real, two human beings, seated side by side, their lifeless eyes staring into the shadows. The explorers backed out of the mine in shock, stumbling into the daylight. One of them dialed 911 with trembling hands, his voice cracking as he told the dispatcher what they had seen. Within hours, deputies and crime scene investigators arrived, sealing off the area. The mine was one of dozens abandoned after the mining boom of the 20th century, left unguarded and rarely visited. Deputies entered cautiously, aware of the risks of collapse, but what they found was far worse than unstable rock. The two victims were young adults, estimated to be in their 20s, dressed in casual clothes that suggested they had not been lost hikers but had come here, or been brought here, for another reason. Their placement was deliberate, almost staged. Seated upright, side by side, their heads tilted slightly toward each other, it looked less like a crime scene and more like a disturbing tableau. Word spread quickly. By nightfall, local news outlets had already broken the story: two bodies found in abandoned Utah mine. The details were scarce, but the shock was immediate. The discovery reopened wounds that had never healed. Residents who remembered the murders of Emma and Daniel 8 years earlier felt their stomachs turn. Was this the work of the same killer? Social media erupted with speculation. Some insisted it was coincidence. Others claimed it was proof that the phantom killer of Moab had returned. Law enforcement tried to hold back information, waiting for forensic analysis, but the silence only fueled rumor. By the next morning, national outlets had picked up the story. The world that had once forgotten the 2011 murders now remembered. Questions poured in. Who were the victims? When had they died? And most chilling of all, was the desert harboring the same predator who vanished years ago? The autopsies were swift but unsettling. The medical examiner determined that the two victims had died only weeks earlier. Their bodies showed signs of violence, though the details were withheld from the public. Unlike Emma and Daniel, they had not been hastily hidden. Instead, their placement in the mine suggested a different message. Investigators were struck by the eeriness of it. The killer had not just taken lives, he had staged them, as if he wanted them to be found. The victims' identities were confirmed within days. Locals from neighboring towns, a young man and woman who had been reported missing just a month earlier. Families who thought their children had simply run away or disappeared into city life were devastated to learn the truth. The chilling connection was not in who they were, but in where they were found. The mine tied the new tragedy directly to the old fears. Investigators immediately drew parallels between the 2011 case and the 2019 discovery. Both involved pairs of young victims. Both were hidden in remote desert locations, and both left behind more questions than answers. Yet there were key differences. Emma and Daniel had been hastily covered with brush, almost as if the killer wanted them concealed. The 2019 victims were positioned with deliberate care, as though their bodies had been arranged for effect. It raised disturbing possibilities. Had the killer grown bolder? Had he been hiding all along, refining his methods? The FBI quickly reopened the cold file, pulling dusty boxes from archives and comparing old notes with new evidence. The phrase serial killer returned to conversations, no longer whispered but spoken aloud. The Utah desert, which had carried 8 years of silence, was once again at the center of a nightmare. This time, it was louder and harder to ignore. For Moab, the shockwaves were immediate. Businesses that had just regained their momentum worried tourists would once again stay away. Parents pulled their children from camping trips, and hikers canceled plans. Locals spoke of the desert differently now, no longer just as a place of danger from nature, but as a hunting ground for something human, something far worse. Rumors reignited, stories of the phantom miner, the ghostly figure who lived in abandoned shafts. Some believed the killer had been waiting all these years, hidden in plain sight, watching. Others argued it had to be someone new, a copycat who had chosen the mine to mimic the unsolved murders of 2011. Either way, the effect was the same. Fear gripped the community again, and the desert, once beautiful, became a place people no longer trusted. Silence had returned, but now it was heavier, filled with dread. Sarah Collins heard the news while sitting in her small Salt Lake City apartment. She stared at the headline glowing on her laptop screen, her heart pounding as if the past had come rushing back to claim her. For 8 years, she had carried the Moab murders in her notebooks, in her dreams, in her restless thoughts. She had written anniversary pieces, spoken with grieving families, and walked the desert trails where Emma and Daniel had vanished. But nothing had changed, until now. She knew instantly that this was not just another crime story. This was connected somehow to the silence that had haunted her since 2011. Grabbing her recorder, notebooks, and camera, Sarah packed a bag and drove south. She felt the same pull she had once felt as a young journalist, the pull of a story that demanded to be told, a mystery that refused to stay buried. When Sarah arrived in Moab, the town felt tense, like it was holding its breath. Police tape fluttered at the entrance to the mine, and news vans lined the nearby dirt road. Families of the new victims had gathered, their faces pale with grief, their voices breaking as they asked why this had happened. Sarah kept her distance, respectful but observant. She recognized the pain. It mirrored what she had seen in 2011. She began interviewing locals, asking what they thought. Many shook their heads, saying, "It's the same man. He's back." Others refused to speak at all, afraid of drawing attention. Sarah noted the fear, the way silence was once again the town's strongest language. For her, it was confirmation that the case of Emma and Daniel had never truly ended. It had only paused, waiting for the right moment to surface again. Now, it was back with force. The FBI's presence grew quickly. Trucks with satellite equipment parked outside the sheriff's office, and agents swarmed the area with new technology unavailable in 2011. Drones scanned the desert, mapping every canyon and abandoned shaft. Ground-penetrating radar was used to search for more hidden bodies. The discovery in 2019 reframed everything. Suddenly, what had seemed like a tragic, isolated event 8 years ago looked like part of a larger pattern. Old notes were reviewed with fresh eyes. Details that once seemed unimportant now raised alarms. Investigators found themselves questioning whether they had underestimated the killer. Had he been active all along? Were there other victims they had missed? For Sarah, the investigation's renewal was both exhilarating and terrifying. She knew the truth was close enough to touch, but she also understood that this time, the answers might reveal something far darker than anyone had imagined. As the investigation unfolded, the staging of the 2019 victims remained the most haunting clue. Experts in criminal psychology debated its meaning. Some suggested the killer was sending a message, mocking law enforcement, daring them to find him. Others believed it showed escalation, proof that the murderer had grown more confident over time. For the families of Emma and Daniel, the discovery was devastating. Old wounds were ripped open, grief revisited like it was brand new. James, Daniel's brother, spoke publicly again, his voice raw with anger. "We begged for this case not to be forgotten," he told reporters. "And now here we are, with more lives lost because no one caught him." His words echoed through the media, a sharp reminder that silence had consequences. For Sarah, it confirmed what she had long believed. The story of 2011 was unfinished, and the desert was not done speaking. The community of Moab gathered once again in vigils, holding candles against the dark desert night. Old faces appeared. People who had mourned Emma and Daniel in 2011 now stood in the same park, mourning two more. For them, the repetition was unbearable, a nightmare playing on a loop. Rumors spread faster than official updates. Some swore they had seen strange lights in the desert. Others claimed to hear voices near mine shafts. The myths of the phantom miner grew stronger, blending with the real terror of a killer who seemed untouchable. Sarah listened carefully, writing everything down, but she kept her focus on facts. She interviewed retired deputies, revisited old evidence, and pressed current investigators for details. The more she dug, the clearer it became. The mine discovery was not just another tragedy. It was a turning point, one that forced everyone, families, law enforcement, and journalists, back into the nightmare. For Sarah, the discovery was personal. She walked the edge of the mine one evening, long after police had packed up for the day. The desert wind whistled through the rocks, carrying dust and silence. She thought of Emma's father, of the way his voice had cracked when he said he only wanted truth. She thought of James, still carrying his brother's memory like a weight. The desert felt the same as it had 8 years earlier, vast, empty, and unbothered by human grief. But now it seemed to be speaking again, not with answers, but with warnings. Sarah wrote in her notebook, "The silence is broken. The story is alive again." She didn't know then how much deeper it would go, how many more secrets lay buried beneath the red stone. All she knew was that she could not look away. The desert was pulling her back in completely. The 2019 discovery reframed the entire case. What had once seemed like a random, isolated crime now looked like part of a chilling pattern. Two pairs of victims, 8 years apart, connected by the same desert, the same silence, and perhaps the same killer. For investigators, it meant reopening old files with new urgency. For families, it meant reopening old wounds with new pain. For Moab, it meant confronting the fear it had tried to bury. And for Sarah, it meant the story she had carried for 8 years was no longer just memory. It was unfolding again in real time. As she filed her first article about the mine discovery, she ended with a question she knew readers would ask themselves. If he has returned once, will he return again? The answer, Sarah felt deep in her bones, was yes. The story wasn't over. It was only beginning. In late 2019, weeks after the discovery of the bodies in the abandoned mine, law enforcement made an announcement that many had waited years to hear. The Moab murders of 2011 were no longer classified as a cold case. They were officially reopened as part of a connected investigation. The press conference drew crowds of reporters, family members, and locals who carried the weight of 8 years of silence. The new sheriff, backed by FBI agents, spoke firmly. "We believe the cases of 2011 and 2019 may be linked. With today's technology and resources, we are committed to finding the truth." For the families, it was bittersweet. On one hand, there was finally movement. On the other, it meant revisiting pain that had never healed. The reopening brought hope, fear, and anticipation all at once. The silence that had ruled for nearly a decade was about to be broken by noise. The task force formed to lead the investigation was larger and better equipped than the original team. Forensic science had advanced significantly since 2011, offering new tools for old evidence. Boxes of dusty files were pulled from archives, and crime scene samples long stored in freezers were thawed and re-examined. The FBI deployed drones to map the desert terrain in ways that had been impossible years before, searching for patterns, campsites, or disturbed soil that might reveal hidden graves. Ground-penetrating radar was used around abandoned mines, probing for cavities or objects beneath the surface. Technology gave investigators fresh eyes, but it also carried weighty questions. Had the killer been active all along? If so, what else had been missed? The community watched closely, desperate for answers yet afraid of what might be uncovered. Each new search brought both hope of discovery and fear of what secrets the desert still held. One of the first breakthroughs came from reanalyzing DNA. In 2011, technology had been limited, and samples collected from Emma and Daniel's case were too degraded for clear results. But by 2019, new testing methods allowed analysts to extract partial profiles from fibers and trace amounts of biological material. The results did not match anyone in the national database, but they revealed something important. The same genetic markers appeared in evidence from both crime scenes, linking the 2011 and 2019 cases to the same unknown male. The news stunned investigators. It was the confirmation they needed. This was not coincidence, not a copycat. It was the same killer, resurfacing after years of silence. For families, the discovery was both terrifying and vindicating. They had long believed the killer was still free, and now it was proven. The Phantom of the Desert was not myth. He was real, and he was still out there. As word spread about the DNA connection, Sarah Collins felt her obsession deepen. She sat in her apartment surrounded by notes, photographs, and transcripts, her hands trembling as she reread the announcement. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the link that proved her instinct right. But instead of feeling triumphant, she felt heavy with dread. It meant the killer she had imagined for 8 years was not a ghost but a man, flesh and blood, still walking somewhere. She returned to Moab, notebook in hand, determined to follow every development. Yet her personal struggles surfaced. Sleepless nights plagued her, dreams filled with desert silence and faceless shadows. She wondered if chasing the story had consumed too much of her life. Friends said she was obsessed, but Sarah knew she couldn't stop now. The story was alive again, and she had become part of it whether she wanted to or not. The investigation pushed deeper into the desert. Teams revisited locations searched in 2011, this time with drones scanning overhead and sensors mapping the ground below. What had once been guesswork became systematic. Dozens of abandoned mines were sealed off for examination, while cadaver dogs were brought in to sniff for human remains. In one shaft, bones were found, though they were determined to be animal remains. In another, personal items were discovered, an old backpack, a pair of hiking boots, but tests showed they belonged to someone unrelated to the murders. Each false lead weighed heavily on investigators, yet they pressed on. The desert was vast, and the killer's ability to vanish seemed almost supernatural. Still, the renewed energy and resources gave hope that persistence would finally pay off. The families clung to every update, desperate for even the smallest detail that could bring them closer to the truth. One deputy, assigned to review old witness statements, found something intriguing in the 2011 files. A hiker had mentioned seeing a man with a worn backpack and camping gear near one of the mining roads. At the time, the description had been vague and dismissed as unreliable. But when cross-referenced with 2019 reports, a pattern emerged. Several locals described a similar figure, scruffy, alone, carrying tools that didn't look like normal camping equipment. The descriptions, though inconsistent, suggested a man who might have lived on the fringes of society, comfortable in the wilderness, blending in as just another drifter. Investigators began to build a psychological profile, someone who avoided attention, knew the land intimately, and could disappear into it for years at a time. To Sarah, the image was chilling. It wasn't a phantom after all. It was a man who had used the desert's silence as his greatest disguise. The pressure on investigators grew as the national spotlight returned. Journalists filled Moab, eager for updates. Families of the victims spoke publicly, urging law enforcement not to fail again. "We've waited too long," James said in one interview. "My brother deserves justice, and so do these new victims." His words resonated with viewers, putting human faces back into the headlines. The sheriff's office, determined not to repeat past mistakes, shared updates more openly than before. Still, the weight of expectation was heavy. Every delay sparked frustration. Every dead end reignited fear. For locals, the return of attention was both comforting and exhausting. They wanted answers, but they also wanted peace. The myth of the Phantom Killer had returned, and now it felt more real than ever. The desert no longer held only silence. It held a ticking clock, counting down to either resolution or another tragedy waiting to happen. Sarah found herself caught between her role as a journalist and her role as a human being. Interviewing the families broke her heart. Emma's father, older now and frilier, spoke in a quiet voice that carried the weight of 8 years of waiting. "I just want to know what happened," he told her, his eyes wet with tears. "Every day without answers is another death." James, hardened by years of activism, spoke with fiery determination, his anger sharper than before. Their pain cut into Sarah, reminding her why she had never let the case go. Yet it also took a toll. At night, she lay awake wondering if her pursuit of the story was helping or hurting, if her articles were bringing awareness or just reopening wounds. The emotional strain pressed down, but she couldn't stop. The truth was closer than ever, and she felt bound to follow it to the end. Forensic teams discovered a new clue in the abandoned mine where the 2019 bodies were found. Hidden in a crevice, overlooked during the first sweep, was a piece of fabric torn from a glove. DNA testing showed it belonged to the same unknown male linked to both crimes. The discovery was small but critical. It confirmed the killer had been physically present at the mine, leaving behind evidence he had once been skilled enough to avoid. Investigators speculated he might be slipping, growing careless, or perhaps intentionally leaving traces to taunt them. The find energized the task force, proving they were not chasing shadows but a real person who could be caught. For Sarah, the clue was a jolt of both fear and hope. The phantom was flesh and bone. His mistakes, however small, could bring him down. But how many lives had been lost before he finally slipped? The investigation expanded beyond Utah. FBI analysts reviewed unsolved cases from neighboring states, searching for patterns. Several deaths in Nevada, Colorado, and Arizona bore similarities. Young victims found in remote areas, signs of restraint, little evidence left behind. None were definitively linked, but the possibility was terrifying. If the killer had been moving across the West, he could have left a trail of victims stretching years. Law enforcement remained cautious, unwilling to confirm connections without proof, but the implication was clear. This was bigger than Moab. For Sarah, the thought was overwhelming. She had believed for years the killer would resurface, but she hadn't imagined the scale. She wondered if the silence of the desert had been hiding not just one story, but many. And if so, what would it mean when the truth finally came out? The phantom wasn't just mythical anymore. He was part of a wider nightmare. The reopening of the case also reignited tension in the community. Some locals welcomed the investigation, hoping for closure. Others feared it would bring more media, more fear, and more disruption to their fragile peace. Business owners worried about tourism collapsing again, while families whispered warnings to children not to stray too far. Old myths resurfaced. Some claimed the killer was a former miner. Others believed he lived underground in the abandoned shafts. The line between fact and folklore blurred once again. Sarah reported carefully, determined not to sensationalize, but she couldn't deny the eerie atmosphere. At night, walking through Moab, she felt eyes on her, as if the killer was still nearby, watching. Her notes filled with observations that read more like confessions of unease than journalistic facts. The desert was speaking again, not with answers, but with the same heavy silence that had haunted her for 8 long years. The emotional toll on investigators grew heavy. Some deputies admitted privately that they felt haunted by the failure of 2011 and feared repeating it. One FBI agent told Sarah, "This case eats at us. We're chasing someone who knows the land better than we ever will." The statement stuck with her. The killer's greatest weapon wasn't just violence. It was the desert itself, the endless terrain that offered cover and escape. Yet the discovery of DNA gave investigators hope. For the first time, they had a tangible thread, one that could potentially identify him through genetic genealogy, the same method that had solved other infamous cold cases. Analysts began running the profile against databases of distant relatives, hoping to build a family tree that would lead to the suspect. It was tedious, slow, and uncertain, but it was progress. The Phantom of Moab was no longer untouchable. His mask was cracking. As 2019 turned into 2020, the investigation carried both urgency and weight. Families demanded answers, journalists pressed for updates, and investigators worked long hours chasing fragile leads. Sarah, though exhausted, remained at the center, her articles keeping the public engaged and reminding readers of the human cost. The killer, once thought mythical, was now proven real, his DNA linking past and present crimes. Still, he remained free, a shadow moving through the vast desert. The reopening of the case had breathed life back into a nightmare, but it also gave the strongest chance yet of resolution. The threads were there: DNA, witness patterns, new technology. The question was whether they could be tied together before the killer struck again. For Sarah, the thought was unbearable. She ended one of her articles with a chilling line: "The desert has spoken. Now, we must decide if we are ready to listen." By the spring of 2020, the investigation had reached a turning point. DNA links had proven the same killer was responsible for both the 2011 and 2019 murders, but investigators still lacked a name. As the task force dug deeper, long-forgotten details began to resurface. Files from 2011 contained notes that had been dismissed as irrelevant, yet now, under fresh scrutiny, they hinted at something more disturbing. A deputy's report mentioned tire tracks near the wash where Emma and Daniel were found, but the detail had never been followed up because it was considered too vague. Another report described a missing pair of gloves from evidence storage. Taken alone, these seemed minor. But together, they suggested mistakes had been made, mistakes that may have allowed the killer to vanish. For families who had waited nearly a decade, it was a painful realization. The truth wasn't just hidden by the desert. It was hidden by human error. As these oversights came to light, Sarah Collins pressed harder in her reporting. She requested documents through Freedom of Information laws, uncovering memos that showed how stretched the sheriff's office had been during the 2011 search. At the time, resources were limited, and deputies were juggling multiple emergencies. Leads weren't pursued fully, evidence wasn't cataloged carefully, and coordination between local law enforcement and the FBI was weaker than anyone had admitted. In one shocking revelation, Sarah found that a ranger had reported suspicious activity near a mine, lights moving at night, footprints by the entrance, but the report was filed and never acted upon. Reading it now, it was impossible to ignore. The killer hadn't simply vanished into thin air. He had slipped through cracks created by bureaucracy, miscommunication, and perhaps even indifference. Sarah's articles forced the public to confront a bitter truth. The silence of 8 years had not been inevitable. The families reacted with fury. James, Daniel's brother, spoke out again, this time more forcefully than ever. "We begged them not to give up," he told a television interviewer. "And now we learn that critical reports were ignored, that evidence was mishandled. My brother didn't just die because of a killer, he died because the system failed." His words struck a chord. Emma's father, quieter but no less devastated, wrote an open letter demanding accountability from both local and federal authorities. The letter spread widely online, reigniting public outrage. For the families, the revelation was salt in an open wound. They had lived nearly a decade believing the killer was a phantom who left no trace. Now they learned traces had existed all along, but people had looked the other way. The pain of losing their children deepened into bitterness, a sense that betrayal had compounded their grief. Inside the task force, tension grew. Younger investigators wanted transparency, but older officials resisted, fearing blame. Some argued that dredging up mistakes from 2011 would only distract from the current investigation. Others insisted the public had a right to know. The FBI attempted to strike a balance, acknowledging procedural gaps, but denying outright negligence. For Sarah, this was the moment where the story became larger than a single killer. It was about how institutions fail, how silence isn't only the desert's doing, but also the product of human choices. She interviewed former deputies who admitted feeling pressure to move on quickly back in 2011, fearing the impact on tourism and the town's reputation. One even confessed, "We didn't want Moab to be remembered as a murder town." That single sentence cut deep. Image had been valued over justice, and in that gap, the killer had thrived. As records were re-examined, a disturbing pattern emerged. Reports of missing persons near Utah's deserts in the years between 2011 and 2019 showed similarities. Hikers who never returned, travelers whose cars were found abandoned, campers who vanished without trace. None had been definitively linked to foul play, and most were filed as accidents. But now, investigators could not dismiss them so easily. The killer may not have been silent at all. He may have been active, hidden within statistics, his crimes camouflaged as desert tragedies. If true, the scale of the story was far greater than anyone had imagined. The Phantom was no longer a figure who disappeared for 8 years. He was possibly a predator who had hunted quietly all along, shielded by assumptions and mistakes. The desert had always been dangerous, but the true danger had been man-made and ignored. For the families, this realization was almost unbearable. Flashbacks emerged from old case files, painting a picture of how the killer had escaped detection. In 2011, a witness had reported a white pickup truck parked near the mining road. Deputies had noted it, but didn't pursue it because dozens of trucks matched the description. Another file showed that a set of boot prints was photographed but never analyzed for comparison. The photographs sat in a box, forgotten until now. Reviewing them with modern technology, analysts noted the prints matched boots common among miners, suggesting the killer may have worked in or around the industry. Each overlooked clue was a reminder of missed opportunities. The Phantom had not been untouchable. He had simply been lucky, protected by errors. To Sarah, the flashbacks read like a warning. History repeats itself when lessons aren't learned. And for the families, the details reopened old wounds, proving the silence had been avoidable. The revelations also forced locals to confront uncomfortable truths. Many remembered whispers from 2011 about seeing strangers in town, loners who camped near the river or wandered the canyons. Few had reported them, assuming law enforcement was already overwhelmed. Now, those memories resurfaced, haunting people with guilt. One local woman admitted to Sarah, "I saw a man near the mines that summer. He looked out of place. I told my husband, but we didn't think it mattered. What if that was him?" Her voice broke as she spoke, the weight of hindsight pressing down. These stories suggested that the Phantom had not only been present but visible, blending in just enough to be overlooked. The myth of a ghostly killer was fading. In its place emerged the image of a man who had survived by exploiting human blindness and institutional failure. That truth was far more terrifying than legend. Sarah's reporting gained national attention again. Major outlets picked up her stories, framing them as an indictment of investigative failures. She appeared on talk shows and podcasts, her calm but emotional voice describing how overlooked evidence had shaped the case. But the attention was double-edged. While it gave pressure to law enforcement to act, it also put her in the spotlight in ways she wasn't comfortable with. Strangers sent her messages, some thanking her, others accusing her of exploiting tragedy. At night, she sat alone, replaying the interviews of grieving families, wondering if she was helping or simply opening old wounds. Still, she couldn't stop. She felt a duty to the truth, even if it broke her. Her role had shifted from observer to participant, caught in the storm of revelations that had changed everything. The Phantom was no longer faceless, and Sarah refused to let him stay hidden. The deeper investigators dug, the clearer it became that the crimes were bigger than two tragedies. They found records of transient workers in the area during 2011, some with criminal pasts, but none properly vetted. A federal audit revealed that coordination between agencies had been sloppy. Reports sent to the FBI sat unread for months, while local deputies assumed someone else had followed up. The failures piled up like stones, forming a wall that had protected the killer. For the families, the sense of betrayal was overwhelming. Daniel's mother, who had rarely spoken publicly, finally broke her silence in an emotional interview. "I trusted them to protect my son's memory," she said, tears streaming down her face. Instead, they lost him twice, once to the killer and once to their neglect. Her words captured what everyone felt, that justice had been delayed not by mystery, but by human hands. In private briefings, FBI analysts shared a chilling theory. The killer had likely been aware of the investigation's weaknesses. He may have even tested boundaries, leaving traces deliberately to see if they would be followed. When they weren't, his confidence grew. This would explain the boldness of 2019, where the victims were staged in the mine as if mocking law enforcement. If the theory was correct, the killer wasn't just hiding in the desert. He was playing a game, one he believed he was winning. The thought horrified investigators and families alike. It reframed the story from one of oversight to one of manipulation. The Phantom wasn't mythical, he was calculating. And he had spent years exploiting both the land's vastness and the system's flaws. For Sarah, the theory felt like a knife. The silence of the desert had not been natural. It had been orchestrated. The families gathered for a joint meeting with investigators, the first time both groups sat together since the 2019 discovery. Tension filled the room as parents, siblings, and officials confronted each other. James spoke bluntly, accusing law enforcement of failures. Emma's father asked quietly but firmly why reports had been ignored. Investigators apologized, but apologies could not erase the past. One FBI agent admitted, "We should have done better. We can't change what was missed, but we can change what happens now." The words offered little comfort, but they marked a shift. Families realized the case was not just about their loved ones anymore. It was about every victim who may have been overlooked, every family who had been told their missing child was an accident. The scope of the story had widened. It was no longer just about Emma and Daniel. It was about a system that had failed them all. The revelations also changed Sarah. She no longer saw herself as just a journalist chronicling a mystery. She saw herself as part of a larger fight for truth. Yet the emotional toll weighed heavily. She carried the voices of grieving families with her, their words echoing in her head long after interviews ended. At night, she dreamed of the desert, vast, empty, filled with shadows she couldn't chase away. Sometimes she wondered if the killer read her articles, if he laughed at the chaos left in his wake. The thought unsettled her deeply. Still, she pressed forward, believing the only way to fight silence was to fill it with truth. Her obsession had become purpose. The Phantom was no longer invisible, and Sarah was determined that his story would be exposed, no matter how painful the revelations became. By the end of 2020, the investigation stood on the edge of transformation. The killer's identity remained hidden, but the truth about how he had escaped capture in 2011 was no longer secret. Mistakes, oversights, and perhaps deliberate neglect had created the silence that allowed him to thrive. The families, once isolated in their grief, now saw themselves as part of a larger community of victims, connected by a system that had failed. The killer was still out there, but the myth was gone. He was a man cunning and calculating, who had used both the desert and human weakness to his advantage. For investigators, the revelations were painful, but they also provided clarity. They knew where they had gone wrong. Now the question was whether they could finally make it right. The stage was set for confrontation. The silence was breaking, and the phantom was running out of shadows. In early 2021, after months of forensic analysis and genealogical testing, the task force finally had a breakthrough. The partial DNA profile that had linked both crime scenes was matched to a distant relative in a genealogy database. By painstakingly building a family tree, analysts narrowed it down to one man, Richard Hale, a drifter in his late 40s with a history of short-term jobs in mining and construction. He had no permanent address, no steady employment, and little digital footprint. Records showed he had once worked in Utah mines in the early 2000s before disappearing into a transient lifestyle. Investigators moved cautiously, verifying the connection through discarded DNA collected from a coffee cup he left behind at a roadside diner. The result was undeniable. It matched. The Phantom of Moab was no longer faceless. He had a name, a past, and a trail that could no longer be ignored. The revelation shook everyone involved. For the families, Richard Hale's name was both a relief and a nightmare. Relief, because the Phantom was no longer an abstraction. Nightmare, because he was real human, and had lived free for nearly a decade while their children lay in graves. James, Daniel's brother, reacted with fury. "He walked among us," James said during a televised interview. "He lived," he breathed. "And all this time, he knew what he had done. And we knew nothing." Emma's father, now frail and gray, spoke quietly but with piercing anger. "I want to see his face in court. I want him to hear the names of the people he destroyed." For Sarah Collins, the discovery confirmed what she had feared for years. The killer had not been a ghost. He had been a man hiding in plain sight, using the desert's silence as his shield. The task force tracked Richard Hale's movements across the years. Records showed he had drifted between states, Nevada, Colorado, Arizona, working odd jobs and living in temporary camps. In some areas, unsolved disappearances seemed to align with his presence. The possibility that his crimes extended far beyond Utah became increasingly likely. Yet what disturbed investigators most was how close he had always remained to the Moab area. Reports indicated he had been seen in small Utah towns even in recent years, blending in with seasonal workers. He hadn't disappeared after 2011. He had been circling quietly, confident that no one was looking closely enough. For the community, the revelation was devastating. The Phantom wasn't a stranger passing through. He had been nearby, possibly even among them, for years. The sense of betrayal deepened, fueling anger and fear. The killer wasn't mythical. He was their neighbor, their drifter, their forgotten shadow. As the investigation closed in, Sarah Collins prepared herself to cover the confrontation. She had written about Richard Hale's name cautiously, aware that nothing was official until an arrest was made. But inside, she wrestled with turmoil. For years, she had imagined the Phantom as something inhuman, larger than life. Seeing him reduced to a name, a man with work records and old addresses, unsettled her. It stripped away the myth but made the horror sharper. He was ordinary, and that made him even more terrifying. She drove to Moab again, her car heavy with notebooks and cameras. Along the way, she thought about the families. She wondered how it would feel to finally face the man who had stolen everything from them. For her, it was the climax of a decade-long obsession. For them, it was the reopening of wounds that might never heal, no matter the outcome. The emotional weight on the families grew unbearable as the truth sank in. Emma's mother spoke of sleepless nights, imagining her daughter's last moments and wondering if Hale had watched her suffer. Daniel's father, normally stoic, broke down during an interview, his voice cracking as he said, "We wanted to believe it was a monster, not a man. But now we know it was just a man who chose evil." Their grief turned into rage. James, whose voice had kept the case alive for years, felt betrayed not just by Hale but by the system that had allowed him to slip through the cracks. He attended every briefing, demanded updates, and insisted on being present at every step of the legal process. For him, catching Hale was no longer about justice alone. It was personal vengeance disguised as pursuit of truth. The emotional low point had arrived, heavy and suffocating. When Hale was finally located, it was almost anticlimactic. He had been living in a rundown trailer outside a small Nevada town, working part-time at a scrapyard. FBI agents and deputies surrounded the property in the early morning hours, expecting resistance, but he surrendered quietly. No weapons were found on him. He looked older than his years, with sun-worn skin and unkempt hair. To those who had imagined a phantom, the sight was jarring. He was ordinary, unremarkable, almost pitiful. Yet the DNA proved he was anything but harmless. The arrest sent shockwaves through Utah and beyond. Headlines blared, "Phantom of Moab identified, arrested." For the community, there was a strange mix of relief and despair. Relief that the shadow had a face. Despair that the face was so ordinary, a reminder that evil often looks like nothing special at all. The confrontation had begun, but it came with hollow comfort. In the interrogation room, Hale said little. He denied involvement at first, claiming coincidence, but the DNA evidence was overwhelming. His silence frustrated investigators, who wanted confessions, explanations, anything to fill the void. Instead, they got shrugs and muttered denials. The lack of remorse cut deeply into the families. When James heard about his refusal to admit guilt, he slammed his fist on the table during a press meeting. He knows what he did. We know what he did. Why won't he say it? Emma's father wept quietly, whispering, "Even now he steals from us. He steals truth." Sarah, watching the interrogation footage, felt sick. She had hoped for answers, but Hale's blank expression gave none. The phantom had been exposed, but his silence was another wound. Confrontation wasn't giving clarity. It was deepening the pain, dragging everyone lower than they thought possible. The trial preparations exposed even more heartbreak. Prosecutors worked to build a case that would withstand scrutiny, but gaps from 2011 haunted them. Evidence had been mishandled, reports ignored, and key details lost to time. The 2019 murders gave them strong ground, but the older case was fragile. Families feared justice for Emma and Daniel would be overshadowed or even dismissed. The thought crushed them. James argued fiercely with prosecutors, demanding they fight for his brother's memory. Emma's parents begged for equal recognition of her case. The confrontation wasn't just with Hale anymore, it was with the legal system, which seemed to wobble under the weight of its own past failures. Sarah wrote carefully about the tension, her words measured but urgent. The story was no longer only about a killer. It was about whether justice could survive after years of silence, mistakes, and the slow erosion of truth. For the community, seeing Hale's face for the first time was surreal. Mugshots circulated, showing a tired man with hollow eyes, but locals recognized him. Some remembered seeing him at gas stations. Others swore he had worked odd jobs in town. The realization that he had lived among them for years was chilling. "He was right here," one resident told Sarah. "We thought he was a drifter, just passing through. But he was living beside us. Eating in our diners. Watching." The anger spread quickly. Vigils turned from quiet prayers into angry demands for justice. The town that had once whispered about a phantom now shouted about betrayal. The confrontation wasn't only between Hale and the law, it was between a community and the horror of its own blindness. The phantom wasn't just Hale. It was the silence that had allowed him to blend in. That truth cut deepest of all. Sarah's own breaking point came one night in her motel room, as she prepared another article. She stared at Hale's photo on her laptop screen and felt tears run down her face. For years, she had chased shadows, convinced the phantom was larger than life. Now she saw him for what he was, a man who had destroyed lives, then hidden in plain sight. She felt sick, angry, and hollow all at once. She called her editor and confessed she wasn't sure she could keep writing. "I feel like I'm drowning in their pain," she said. But the editor reminded her why she had started. "You've carried this story for years, Sarah. You can't stop now. People need your voice." She closed her laptop and whispered to herself, "This isn't about me." But deep inside, she knew it was. The confrontation had consumed her as much as anyone else. The families met Hale for the first time in a pre-trial hearing. The room was tense, filled with quiet sobs and clenched fists. James glared at him, his body shaking with rage, while Emma's father clutched a photograph of his daughter. Hale avoided eye contact, his expression flat, his body language detached. For the families, it was unbearable. To see the man who had caused so much pain sit silently, without remorse, was worse than any nightmare. Afterward, James told reporters, "I wanted him to look at me. I wanted him to see what he did. But he wouldn't. He's a coward." Emma's father added softly, "He's not a phantom. He's emptiness wearing a face." Their words echoed through the community, capturing the devastating emotional low point. The confrontation had brought them to Hale, but it had not given them what they truly needed: truth, remorse, or closure. As the legal process dragged on, bitterness deepened. Families clashed with prosecutors over strategy, locals argued over how justice should be served, and Sarah struggled to balance empathy with professionalism. The confrontation stretched beyond Hale into every corner of the story: families confronting their grief, investigators confronting their past failures, and a community confronting its silence. The weight was crushing. Yet beneath it all, there was a flicker of resolve. The truth was out. The phantom had a name, a face, and a history. He could no longer vanish into myth. The emotional cost was unbearable, but it carried with it a strange power. For the first time in years, everyone knew who they were fighting against. The desert no longer hid a faceless shadow. It held a man who would finally be forced into the light. The confrontation was brutal, but it was also necessary. By mid-2021, the stage was set for the reckoning. Richard Hale sat in custody, awaiting trial, his silence infuriating but his presence undeniable. The families, though broken, stood together, united by grief and rage. Sarah, exhausted but determined, prepared to cover the final chapters of the story she had carried for nearly a decade. The confrontation had stripped away illusions. The phantom was not mythical, not untouchable. He was a man, ordinary and monstrous at once. Yet justice felt painfully fragile. The cost of getting here was immense, and the outcome was uncertain. As Hale was led from the courtroom one day, shackled and stone-faced, James shouted after him, "You will not hide anymore." The words captured the moment perfectly. The phantom had been exposed. The confrontation was no longer in shadows. It was face-to-face, and the reckoning was about to begin. By the summer of 2021, the trial of Richard Hale had become one of the most closely watched cases in Utah's history. Courtrooms filled with journalists, grieving families, and curious locals. For years, the phantom had been faceless, a myth that haunted the desert. Now he sat at the defense table in shackles, thin and weathered, staring blankly ahead. The prosecution prepared a case built on DNA, witness patterns, and the haunting similarities between the 2011 and 2019 murders. Their opening statement was simple but powerful. For nearly a decade, this man hid in the silence of the desert. Today, that silence ends. For the families of Emma Daniel and the 2019 victims, the words were almost too much to bear. They had waited years for this reckoning. Finally, the killer who had stolen their children's lives would be forced to face the truth, not in myth, but in a court of law. The trial unfolded with painful detail. Jurors were shown crime scene photographs, carefully chosen to avoid unnecessary shock, but still brutal in their truth. Experts testified about DNA evidence, explaining how new technology had extracted partial profiles from fibers in both cases. They described how those profiles matched the glove fragment found in the mine, and how genealogy work had led directly to Hale. The evidence was overwhelming, a web that pointed only to him. Yet Hale remained silent, his expression flat, offering no reaction as the walls closed in. Families sat in the gallery, their faces tight with grief. Emma's mother wept quietly, holding her husband's hand. James clenched his fists, his jaw locked as if holding back rage. Each detail was another wound reopened, another reminder of the years lost to silence. Justice was close, but the cost of hearing the truth felt almost unbearable. Witness testimony added to the weight. Retired deputies admitted mistakes from 2011, acknowledging that tire tracks, boot prints, and witness reports had been overlooked. Their honesty, though painful, helped prosecutors paint a clearer picture of Hale's movements. A forensic psychologist testified that the staging of the 2019 bodies suggested confidence, even arrogance, in the killer. He believed he could not be caught, the expert explained. By leaving them seated in the mine, he was sending a message that he controlled the desert and law enforcement could do nothing. The courtroom was silent as those words hung in the air. Families stared at Hale, searching for any sign of reaction, but he remained still. The reckoning was not only about facts. It was about stripping away his myth, exposing him as a man who had hidden behind silence and arrogance. Each testimony chipped away at the phantom image, revealing the truth. Sarah Collins sat in the press section, notebook open, heart pounding as she listened. She had covered countless trials, but none carried this much weight. This wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was the climax of nearly a decade of fear and obsession. She scribbled notes about the evidence, but her mind drifted to Emma's father, sitting 2 rows ahead. She thought of James, his eyes blazing with anger. She thought of her own years spent chasing shadows in the desert. The reckoning wasn't just happening in the courtroom. It was happening inside every person who had carried the weight of silence. Sarah knew her role was to report, but she felt more like a witness to history, someone who had been pulled into the story from the very beginning. For her, this was both professional and personal. The truth was finally being spoken, and it was heavier than she had imagined. When the defense began their case, their strategy was thin. With DNA linking Hale to both crime scenes, their arguments focused on technicalities. They questioned the handling of evidence in 2011, suggested contamination, and argued that genealogy methods were unreliable. But experts countered with clear explanations, showing how procedures had been followed. The defense also tried to humanize Hale, describing him as a drifter who had suffered hardship, but the jury was unmoved. The families were enraged by the attempt. James shook his head in disgust, whispering to Sarah afterward, "Hardship doesn't give you the right to kill. He's no victim." The defense's case only highlighted the strength of the prosecution's evidence. The reckoning was not just legal, it was moral. The community rejected the idea of Hale as anything but a predator. His silence, his blank expression, spoke louder than any words the defense could muster. The most emotional moment of the trial came when family members gave victim impact statements. Emma's father stood before the court, his voice trembling but clear. "For 10 years, I have carried my daughter's absence like a stone in my chest. Every birthday, every holiday, I look at her photograph and wonder what she would be doing now. You stole that from her. You stole that from us. And you sat in silence while we begged for truth." Daniel's brother James followed, his words sharper, filled with rage. "You thought you were invisible. You thought the desert would hide you. But you were wrong. We found you. And now the world knows who you are." The courtroom was silent as their voices filled the air. Even jurors looked shaken. The reckoning was not only about evidence. It was about giving the victims back their voices after years of silence. As closing arguments began, prosecutors emphasized the weight of time. For 10 years, This man lived free while families lived in grief, the lead attorney said, pointing at Hale. For 10 years, he believed he had beaten the system. But today, the evidence, the truth, and the voices of the families have caught up to him. Justice delayed is still justice delivered. The defense repeated their arguments, but their words felt hollow in the face of overwhelming proof. When the jury left to deliberate, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Families held hands, waiting for the moment they had dreamed of for years. Sarah scribbled in her notebook, her breath shallow. The reckoning had built to this point, a decade of silence collapsing into a single decision. Hours passed like days as the jury weighed the truth. For everyone waiting, it was a test of endurance, patience, and fragile hope. When the jury returned, the courtroom fell silent. The foreman stood, voice steady as he read the verdict, guilty on all counts. The words rang like thunder. Families gasped, some crying, some shouting in relief. James embraced his mother, tears streaming down his face. Emma's father bowed his head, whispering a prayer. Even Sarah, hardened by years of reporting, felt tears spill down her cheeks. Hale sat motionless, his expression unchanged, as though the verdict meant nothing. But to everyone else in the room, it meant everything. The phantom was no longer free. The silence had been broken, and justice had spoken. The reckoning had arrived. The courtroom erupted in emotion, not celebration but release, the release of years of fear, grief, and anger. The cost had been unbearable, but for the first time in a decade, there was a sense of truth, even if it could never erase the pain. The sentencing phase followed quickly. Prosecutors pushed for life without parole, citing the brutality of the crimes and the years of silence Hale had imposed on the families. The judge agreed, handing down the maximum sentence allowed by law. Hale showed no emotion as the decision was read. He was led away in shackles, disappearing through the courtroom door as quietly as he had lived in the shadows for years. For the families, it was both a victory and a reminder of what they had lost. Emma and Daniel would never return. The 2019 victims would never smile again. Justice had been delivered, but closure remained elusive. The reckoning gave answers, but it could not give back what was stolen. Outside the courthouse, vigils turned into gatherings of reflection. People lit candles, not in fear this time, but in memory. The desert silence had been broken, but it still carried echoes of sorrow. In the weeks that followed, Sarah reflected deeply on the trial. She wrote her most personal article yet, titled The Desert Speaks. In it, she described how silence had ruled for years, how families had lived in darkness, and how justice had finally forced the truth into the light. She admitted her own obsession, confessing that the case had shaped her life for nearly a decade. "I thought I was chasing a phantom," she wrote, "but I was chasing the silence he left behind. And now, that silence has finally been broken." Her words resonated widely, sparking conversations about justice, closure, and the resilience of families who refused to give up. For Sarah, the reckoning was not just about Hale's conviction. It was about honoring the voices of the people who had carried the weight of truth when no one else would. The human cost of the case became clearer in the aftermath. James admitted in interviews that the verdict brought relief but not peace. "I don't feel closure," he said. "I feel like we dragged the truth into the light, but the hole in my life is still there." Emma's father echoed the sentiment. Justice is important, but nothing fills the silence of her absence. These words reminded the public that justice does not erase grief. The reckoning had forced truth into the open, but the pain would remain forever. Still, their resilience inspired many. People sent letters of support from around the world, telling the families they were not alone. For the community of Moab, it was a turning point. They could no longer pretend the phantom was a myth. They had faced him, unmasked him, and survived. The desert was no longer just a place of silence. It was a place of survival. As Hale was transferred to a maximum security prison, investigators continued to review unsolved cases across the West. The reckoning had not ended with his conviction. it had opened doors to other truths. Families of missing persons called in, asking if their loved ones might also have been victims. The possibility was grim but real. For Sarah, this realization was sobering. The reckoning was not a neat ending. It was a heavy reminder of how much silence still lingered, how many stories remained untold. She traveled back to the desert one last time, standing at the edge of the canyon where Emma and Daniel had once walked. The wind howled through the rocks, carrying the same stillness she had known for years. But now it felt different. It was no longer oppressive silence. It was silence filled with memory, truth, and the resilience of those who refused to let the story die. By late 2021, the reckoning was complete. Richard Hale was behind bars for life, the phantom stripped of myth and exposed as a man who had thrived in silence. Families, though still grieving, had been given truth. The community, though scarred, had confronted its fear. And Sarah, though exhausted, had carried the story to its final chapter in court. The reckoning was not joyous. It was heavy, painful, and costly. But it was necessary. After years of waiting, the silence of the desert had been pierced by the voices of families, investigators, and truth-tellers who refused to let it rest. The story was not yet over. The aftermath remained, with healing still uncertain. But the reckoning had given something vital: acknowledgement. The phantom no longer haunted the land unseen. He was confined, exposed, and named. The desert had spoken. Now, the people who lived under its shadow could begin to heal. In the months after Richard Hale's conviction, the desert around Moab felt different. The red cliffs still glowed at sunset, the rivers still cut through stone, and tourists still came to hike and explore. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The phantom was gone. The silence he had used as cover had been broken. Families who had carried grief for nearly a decade now had something solid: a name, a face, and the certainty that he would never walk free again. For Emma's parents, it meant they could finally bring their daughter's story to a close, even if the pain would never leave. For Daniel's family, it meant they could stand at his grave without wondering if justice would ever come. And for Moab, it meant the whispers could finally give way to conversations, not about fear, but about healing. The desert's shadow had lifted, even if faint scars remained. The families organized memorials to honor their children. In France, Emma's parents planted a garden of wildflowers in her name, inviting her friends to share stories of her adventurous spirit. They wanted her remembered not for the way she died, but for the way she lived, curious, joyful, and brave. In England, Daniel's brother James launched a scholarship fund for young people who dreamed of traveling, determined to turn grief into opportunity for others. Both families traveled to Utah one last time, standing at the desert's edge together, united in sorrow but also in strength. They spoke softly of closure, though they admitted the word never felt complete. "Closure is a myth," Emma's father said quietly to Sarah Collins. "But truth, that is real. And now, at least, we have truth." The memorials became a symbol not just of loss, but of resilience, a reminder that love could outlast even silence. In Moab, the community slowly began to reclaim its sense of peace. Candlelight vigils turned into gatherings of remembrance, where locals spoke openly about the fear that had haunted them for so long. Businesses reopened with new energy, eager to show the world that Moab was more than a place of tragedy. Tour guides incorporated stories of resilience into their talks, reminding visitors that while the desert could be harsh, it could also be a place of healing. Parents still warned children to be careful, but the warnings no longer carried the same weight of dread. The phantom was gone, and the town knew it. Yet healing was not simple. For some, the years of fear had left permanent marks. Hikers admitted they still felt uneasy near abandoned mines. Campers said the silence of the desert at night no longer felt peaceful, but haunted. Healing was possible, but scars remained. Sarah Collins, who had carried the story for nearly a decade, faced her own resolution. After Hale's sentencing, she returned to her small Salt Lake City apartment and finally packed away the boxes of notes, photographs, and transcripts that had filled her life for so long. She did not throw them out, she couldn't, but she placed them in storage, a symbolic step toward release. She continued writing, but now her focus shifted from crime to resilience, exploring how communities heal after trauma. Yet she could not fully let go. She returned to the desert one last time, walking along the trails where Emma and Daniel had once wandered. She listened to the silence, no longer as a threat, but as a companion. "The desert doesn't speak in words," she wrote in her final piece. "It speaks in memory. And memory is how we keep truth alive." Her words became her closure. The reckoning had given Sarah clarity about her role. She realized she had not just been a journalist, she had been a voice for the families when the system had failed them. She had carried their grief, their anger, and their hope into the public eye, refusing to let the story die. In interviews, she admitted the toll it had taken, but she said she would never regret it. "Some stories demand more of you," she told one interviewer. This one demanded everything. Her honesty resonated with many, and her reporting was later recognized with awards. But for Sarah, recognition mattered little. What mattered was that the silence had been broken, that the phantom had been unmasked, and that the families had been given truth. Her work was done, but the memory would always live with her, etched into her heart like the red stone of the desert. For investigators, the aftermath brought its own lessons. The failures of 2011 were studied carefully, becoming part of training programs to ensure they would not be repeated. Law enforcement acknowledged publicly that mistakes had been made, and though it did little to ease past pain, it marked progress. FBI analysts continued reviewing unsolved cases across the West, searching for other victims who might be connected to Hale. Some families found comfort in the effort, while others felt fresh pain, fearing their loved ones might also have been his. The reckoning had not ended the story entirely, it had widened it. But at least in Moab, there was certainty. The killer who had once haunted their desert was no longer free. The phantom was gone, and though silence still lingered in the canyons, it no longer belonged to him. It belonged once again to the people who lived there, and to memory. The desert itself became a place of pilgrimage for some. Tourists came not only to hike and raft, but to visit the sites tied to the case. Some left flowers near the wash where Emma and Daniel were found. Others hiked to the mine, though it was now sealed, to stand in silence and reflect. Locals had mixed feelings about this attention. Some resented it, fearing their tragedy was becoming spectacle, while others welcomed it, believing remembrance kept the victims' voices alive. Sarah wrote that the desert had become a living memorial, a landscape etched with both beauty and pain. "When the wind moves through the canyons," she wrote, "it carries memory, not fear. And in that memory, there is strength." For many, that became the final meaning of the story. The desert, once haunted by silence, had become a place where truth echoed louder than fear. James, who had fought tirelessly for his brother's memory, admitted that the end of the trial left him both relieved and empty. "I've been fighting for so long," he told Sarah. "Now that it's over, I don't know what to do with myself." He poured his energy into the scholarship fund he had created, traveling to schools to speak about resilience and justice. His words inspired young people, reminding them that tragedy could be turned into purpose. Emma's parents, though quieter, found their own way of coping. They returned to their garden often, sitting among the wildflowers planted in her honor. They spoke softly of her, imagining her laughter in the wind. Their grief never left, but it softened into something they could carry. The phantom had taken their children, but he had not taken their love. And that love became their final act of defiance against silence. For the wider public, the story left lasting lessons. Documentaries, podcasts, and books retold the case, framing it as both a tragedy and a cautionary tale. Experts spoke of the dangers of vast landscapes, of investigative failures, and of the resilience of families who refused to give up. But beyond the analysis, the story touched people because it was human. It was about parents who buried their children, about a brother who fought for justice, about a community that faced its fear, and about a journalist who refused to let silence win. The phantom had once been a myth, but in the end, The story was not about him. It was about the people who stood against him, who endured years of silence and still found the strength to speak. That truth gave the story its final meaning, one that echoed far beyond Utah's desert. As the years passed, the desert began to heal in its own way. The canyons filled again with laughter from hikers. Campfires glowed with stories of adventure, not fear. Locals spoke less of the phantom and more of resilience, proud of how their town had survived one of the darkest chapters in its history. Yet the memory remained, etched into the landscape like carvings in stone. Every trail carried a reminder, every mine shaft a shadow. But instead of fear, those reminders now carried strength. The community had faced the worst and endured. They had unmasked the phantom, confronted their silence, and reclaimed their land. For Sarah, James, and Emma's parents, healing was not a single moment but a lifelong process. But they knew one truth for certain: the desert was no longer haunted by silence. It was alive with memory, and memory was stronger than fear. Sarah's final reflection came during an interview years later. Asked what she had learned from carrying the story for so long, she paused before answering. "I learned that justice is heavy. It doesn't erase pain. It doesn't give closure, but it gives truth. And truth matters." She added softly, "The desert taught me that silence can be broken. You just have to keep listening." Her words echoed the feelings of many who had followed the story. It was not a neat ending, not a happy one, but it was honest. And honesty, after so many years of silence, was its own form of healing. Her reflection became widely quoted, a reminder that stories of tragedy are not just about loss, but about endurance. In the end, the phantom was gone, but the voices of the victims remained. They had been silenced in life, but in memory, they spoke forever. The story of the Phantom Killer became part of Utah's history, a chapter that would never be forgotten. It was taught in classrooms, studied in criminology courses, and remembered in the community's collective memory. But beyond its facts and timelines, it lived on as a story of resilience. Families who refused to give up, a community that faced its fear, and a journalist who carried truth like a burden became the real legacy. For those who stood in the desert, looking out at the endless red stone, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt full of memory, full of voices, full of truth. The phantom had once used silence to hide. Now silence had been reclaimed as a space for remembrance. The final chapter was not about him. It was about everyone who had survived him, and about the desert itself, which now carried not fear but strength. In the end, the Utah desert stood unchanged, vast, timeless, and silent. But for those who knew the story, that silence carried new meaning. It was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of truth, of memory, of resilience. Families had laid their children to rest with dignity. Justice had been delivered, though it could never erase grief. The community had faced its darkest chapter and emerged scarred but strong. And Sarah, who had once chased shadows, now carried light. The story had come full circle, from silence to truth, from myth to man, from fear to resilience. The desert would always hold its secrets, but this one had been forced into the open. And with it came a question for all who listened. Do you believe justice truly brings closure, or does the pain always remain, echoing in the silence?